Welcome, bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvindos to today's lecture by Professor Héctor Beltrán, which will be focused on his book, Codework, Hacking Across the US-Mexico Techno-Borderlands. Thank you, Professor Beltrán, for joining us today, and special thanks to our collaborators in the Department of Anthropology and in the program in Science, Technology, and Society. And that's so kind of you to be here. Welcome. For those who are joining us on the live stream, please submit any questions or comments via the YouTube chat section. Kindly note, this event will not be available online after the lecture. For those of you who are in the building, thanks to also our partnership with the Stanford Bookstore, we have some books available for purchase, and the author has graciously agreed to sign them. And then, as you all know, here at the Center for Latin American Studies, we like our MA students to introduce our speakers. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to Fabiola Cruz Lee. Fabiola.
Thank you. So, Héctor Beltrán is a Career Development Associate Professor of Anthropology at MIT, where he teaches classes on subjects such as the cultural dimensions of computing, practices of hacking from the Global South, and Latinx and Latin American identities, politics and social movements. He is a sociocultural anthropologist who draws upon his interdisciplinary background to study how the technical aspects of computing inform and are shaped by social structures and lived experiences of identity, race, ethnicity, class, and nation. Today's lecture will discuss his book, Codework, Hacking Across the US-Mexico Techno-Borderlands, in which he examines Mexican and Latinx coders' personal strategies of self-making as they navigate a transnational economy of tech work. Beltrán shows how these hackers apply concepts from the code worlds to their lived experiences, deploying batches, loose coupling, iterative processing or looping, hacking, prototyping, and full-stack development in their daily social interactions, at home, in the workplace, on the dating scene, and in an understanding of the economy, culture, and geopolitics. Thank you so much, Héctor Beltrán, for being with us here today.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I think it's a privilege to share my work with all of you. Especially thanks to Elizabeth Sainz Ackerman, Hector Hoyos, Sara Leonor Clemente, and Fabiola Cruz Lee for the invitation and the introductions. It's also nice to be back in the Bay Area. I came from, where I teach in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Starting to get cold. It's nice to get away. But also, this project came out of a dissertation I did at Berkeley in the Department of Anthropology. And there was a lot of moving around, between both sides of the Bay, coming to tech startup events, conferences, sort of all around the Bay Area, trying to connect what was going on in that particular moment in time. So let's shuttle back to the mid-2010s to think about what's going on. Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, Theranos valued around $10 billion. A lot of hype around startups, around what they can become, but also about the code. People really interested in code as a tool for empowerment. What can people get out of programming? A lot of hype around these code worlds. Ethnographically, empirically, what did I actually do? I went to a lot of these hackathon events, entrepreneurship and tech conferences and workshops, the creation of this hacker school in Mexico City, which I talk about in the book, but mainly the hackathon as a space to observe how all of these different dimensions of politics, technology, culture come together. As an ethnographer, the space of the hackathon had its particular affordances for studying some of these dimensions. So what is a hackathon? I might not have to explain this to folks here. Has anybody been to a hackathon? Mostly everybody. What is a hackathon? Any of you that raise your hand, or which one have you been to? You in the colorful shirt here in the middle.
So I studied computer science in undergrad, and so in undergrad, hackathons were where you got fed. And you might come out with something cool, you make some friends. You can do it It would start like sometimes at midnight, go on for the entire weekend. Some people would sleep there in sleeping bags. Some people would go home. Some people had massive cases of like Monster and other energy drinks. These are just descriptions. I'm not giving a definition.
Beautiful. You brought us right into the world of the hackathon, which is basically hacking and marathon together. Usually over the time frame of a weekend, folks come together. The idea is that they don't know each other. The events are normally themed around some overarching solution to a problem: healthcare, immigration, like the ones I study in certain cases. What were some themes of the hackathons you went to?
It was, I feel like it was dependent on whoever wanted to host it. So if it was at the med school, it would be a healthcare app hackathon where you design, build, test applications in healthcare. Sometimes it would be for social justice, sometimes it would be for environmental justice. There's always some sort of institutional benefit.
Absolutely. Different sponsors, different hosts, different spaces. But the idea of the forum is that people get together, find a technical or technocratic solution to some problem. And the key component of most hackathons is the pitch at the end, right? So modeled after Silicon Valley dynamics, you pitch your project to a panel of so-called experts or judges, and they deem a winner for the event. So maybe they fed you the whole weekend, but also maybe they give you some prize at the end of the event. So for people who might say, well, why these hackathons? I never heard of them, or maybe they sound interesting. Well, there was a lot going on. An institution that decided to enumerate the stuff of hackathons in 2016 said there were, in the year, 3,450 hackathon events, 200,000 plus participants, 13,000 plus prototypes in over 100 countries. So there was a lot of stuff being made, a lot of hype around the events, but also some very unique events, a lot of firsts in the hackathon world. One first, Fix It in Mexico City, advertised as the first by women for women hackathon in Latin America. Here in the Bay Area, when I was doing research, the first hackathon for Latinos, the first hackathon for Black folks, the first hackathon by and for people of color, etc. So a lot of excitement around these. Shouting out to Mexico City. You might think this line here is to get into a concert or something. It was to get into a hackathon, right? So the young folks here with a line out the door to get into the space to hack away over the weekend. And in Mexico, they didn't have this free food necessarily that you were getting over here. So what attracts people to the code? What are my questions? And most importantly, as I move transnationally to the south, thinking about the productive work that goes on in these spaces. It's easy to critique them as these neoliberal spaces, sponsored by these tech companies sometimes. But between that critique and excitement, what's the productive work going on within these spaces from Mexico, across the US-Mexico border? What does it mean to think, in this case, from the Techno-Borderlands, where I'm arguing that we can situate the code while holding other types of analyses in place. So I mentioned the critique of the hackathon, I would say, goes along these three main threads. In the first one, scholars analyze it as the emergence of the DIY and maker movement that centers hacking as broad, clever practice. With the rise of these hacker spaces, you also see the rise of fab labs, maker spaces that center hacking, making as a type of activity. Making hacking framed as a solution to social and economic struggles by enabling a return to a state of authentic, deep, hands-on engagement with the world, one that was presumably lost due to the outsourcing of manufacturing, advances in IT, making hacking thus framed as being opposed to some sort of passive consumer culture. Second thread, represented by these two ethnographies here, hackathons as they're advanced by governments with interest in creating these spaces as models for a new society where openness, acceptance, discussion, and participation flourish, where these digital technologies can lead to some sort of empowerment. From the state's perspective, in this case, the construction of these spaces, whether permanent or temporary, represent some new form of innovative culture. They function as these performances of modernity, development, modernization appear so that you can perform some sort of economic competitiveness. Within these spaces, and here comes the neoliberal critique, young people are encouraged to take matters into their own hands, assume their role as technical, non-complaining, entrepreneurial citizens, especially as Lily Irani proposes in her book. This third thread takes on these industry sponsorings of the hackathon space. Overlaps with the second thread as well, but it emphasizes Silicon Valley looming large in the background of the hackathon. Quite literally, as I described, with quotes and images of these, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. But within this thread, we can also analyze it as a sort of microcosm of the Silicon Valley dynamics, where participants perform these volatile allegiances and mimic this high-speed, high-innovation, free market business process. I'm right in the middle of it here, so I might not even have to say this, but while Silicon Valley is a diverse region by no means governed by a single ethos, the conventional reference to techno-entrepreneurialism, high-tech capitalism, has come to represent pre-packaged toolkits that attempt to emulate these professional identities and economic success in these so-called innovation hubs around the world. So things here quickly turn to describing how there's a corporate, capitalization on this from below energy so that companies can promote their products and have developers work on their technical infrastructures. So the critique here is that hacking is co-opted and it's just a training ground for this grunt work of the knowledge economy. But what's my hackathon work here? What else am I thinking about when I say between critique and excitement? What's being made at the hackathons? Perhaps a heightened sense of agency, perhaps connections and solidarities that wouldn't have happened otherwise. What does it mean to think with the code? What does it mean to think with the code from the South, especially for communities that have been systematically, historically excluded from these cultures of hacking and innovation? Ethnographically, I have particular principles that I come into these spaces with, respecting my research participants, paying attention to what they're doing, what hacking means to them, how they see themselves practicing hacking, as much as possible trying to come in without my preconceived notions or definitions, sort of the dream of ethnography, right? So I want to convince you that we should think with 3 keywords to analyze what's going on in these spaces: code worlds, code work, and Techno-Borderlands. So one thing I was inspired by when I read ethnographies in graduate school, in particular a class with Lo Xiu in the Department of Ethnic Studies at Berkeley, was how to intervene in your own story as you're telling it. So every one of my chapters opens up with one of these ex votos, or reinterpretations of these ex votos. Anybody want to read here in either the English or Spanish?
Le dedico este retablito a Python, el dios de los ceros y unos, que después de tanto esfuerzo y desvelo, mi programa compiló justo a tiempo para la entrega. Visionudo, Chicoalapán, Estado de México.
Great. So what I did here was talk with the artist about the field work I was doing. I noticed she was explaining what I was doing to other people in some sense better than I was. So she made these illustrations of some of the work that happened. A classic ethnographic scene is a lot of the times after the weekend of working, right as these participants were about to hit compile on their program to turn them in, they would pray to some god, in this case Python, the god of zeros and ones, that their code would actually work. So I thought it was interesting that something we think about as very technical, objective, somehow we left to this overarching sort of power so that the code would actually work. The ex voto itself, if you recognize the form, in the Latin world, it usually depicts a dangerous incident, that an offerer survived. In the Mexican context, you'll commonly see these related to border crossings, usually offered to the Virgen de Guadalupe, although we see other sorts of gods show up in the form. And if you've been to Mexico City markets recently, you'll also see them, their contemporary manifestations as the offerer depicting some street crime they survived, a dog attack, the metro collapsing, sort of things that happen in the everyday in Mexico City. That was kind of a joke there, all right. And the artist here doing some sort of hacking herself, right? Disparate elements, something about the modern, the traditional. These pieces in particular were pre-Hispanic from the Museo de Antropología in Jalapa. So she kind of is placing them in this context of innovation, technology, computing. And you'll see as I show some more how these ex-votos kind of take on the hacking ethos themselves. And through the images, I want to propose that the keywords will bring us to this kind of border work I'm proposing across binaries, differences, code worlds, code work, the Techno-Borderlands finally. Another inspiration I had when I was thinking about this work was Karen Ho's ethnography about Wall Street called Liquidated, one of my favorite books, where she studies the constructions of financial markets and the bursting of market bubbles. She focuses on the daily practices, values, dispositions that come to define Wall Street's culture. She argues that investment bankers see themselves as incarnations of the market. They become one with its rhythms and movements. I wondered, were there similar dynamics at play for these programmers? Did they become one with the logics that drive the code worlds, with the rhythms and movements from the worlds of computing? Here I'm inspired by previous researchers of software development who understand that what's in the code is always influenced by more than the code itself. What ends up in the code proper, as well as the very style and approach one brings to coding, is always influenced by dispositions carefully cultivated by the conditions around us, and vice versa. In her longitudinal and multi-sided ethnography, Biela Komen shows us how the technical craft of coding requires a constant awareness and arrangement of form. Software programmers develop the competence to transfer these mental dispositions into other arenas of life. For those of you in the anthropology worlds, you'll see code worlds brings us back to media worlds. What do I mean by that? I'm using code worlds to point to the space and time coders inhabit when they become immersed in programming. It helps me illuminate this back and forth I'm getting at between code and social life. The term builds on the work by media anthropologists who define the media worlds as the network of production, circulation, and reception of expressive and audiovisual forms. So in the early 2000s, we have these media anthropologists who say media should be understood in this sense. Or a media anthropology should be understood in this sense. Not only how media are embedded in people's quotidian lives, but also how consumers and producers are themselves imbricated in discursive universes, political situations, economic circumstances, national settings, historical moments, transnational flows, to name a few of these relevant contexts. By situating media as social practice within these shifting political and cultural frames, these ethnographic approaches promised to illuminate how media challenge or support power structures, the imaginative alternatives to studying these media infrastructures, as well as the role of media technologies in the construction of selves and collectives. A lot of this early work in media anthropology thought about indigenous people, how they appropriate technology as tools for self-representation. So to make this parallel and think about the code instead of the media, I argue necessarily means thinking with the makers of these root infrastructures that underlie these computational technologies. To explore the code worlds ethnographically, anthropologically, means to consider how coding is inherently a social practice embedded in the specific cultural and political context, influenced by the power structures that mold the infrastructures themselves. A scene from one of the hacker schools where I worked with research participants in Mexico City. I followed these research participants as they extend the hackathon in time and space and create this hacker school. Programmers hone their coding skills, show newcomers the way of the code worlds, and think with coding concepts such as the exception to move about the world and organize themselves. Kike, one of the founders, tells me how the school helps beginning hackers connect with potential employers. Since the school is nomadic, each batch of students takes part in the 12-week program across different sites in Mexico City. They hold their trainings and events within co-working spaces, government offices, tech companies. It varies. While they're not involved in the operations of the organizational entity, they do promote hacker students for their advertised jobs within the company or institution or government office. The idea is that a few participants might transition into these professional worlds, but not compromise the hacker ethic that this hacker school has so carefully cultivated. If there's no match, the hacker comes back to the next batch and we try again. It's like catching an exception, Kika tells me. So an exception in the computing worlds is where there's an anomaly or unusual occurrence during the normal flow of a program's execution. A defensive programmer plans for these exceptions, thinking about anything that can go wrong during the program's execution, and prepares these special cases to handle the exception. So as each of the batches of the hacker school progresses through the program, and the school organizes these events within the other spaces, they interview workers to get a feel for the workplace dynamics, such as their retention rates, the coder satisfaction, nepotism. They study the political moves within. Instead of simply responding to these job advertisements that would allow the companies to exploit their coding skills, the hacker school envisions that their careful analyses of the inner workings of these spaces will allow them to create an overall better system. If there's no match, as Kika described, if their coding skills are not necessarily valued, or their organization might compromise these hacker ethics, then they'll try again. In computing terms, they'll catch this exception. Unlike other entrepreneurs who embody the rhythms of neoliberal life, Kike and these other hacker entrepreneurs I work with stay close to the code. These design principles and concepts, such as loose coupling, batches, iterations, serve to make sense of the shifting relationships and their current situations. Loose coupling, for example, is a computing term that refers to a robust way to write code. Data structures can use other components in an interconnected system without necessarily knowing the full implementation of other components. In this way, each component becomes more autonomous and can be used for different purposes by other components. Elements become coupled in this way without having direct knowledge of each other. My research participants use this concept to refer to their flexible work arrangements in the face of contracts and transnational managers who attempt to exploit them. So they played with the term, thinking about how they might manage separation of concerns as they're faced with these precarious work conditions, how they might interface with these arrangements while still maintaining some sense of autonomy. But what I'm arguing here is more than just borrowing language or metaphors from the code worlds. It's about slowing things down, seeing how things work, attempting to rearrange relationships with state representatives, private companies, or other entities. And remember, inspired by Ho, I want to see if these code workers become one with the code world, with the logics that drive computing, with the rhythms and movements from the world's computing. So back to another ex voto that opens up one of my chapters. Here we're gonna have to read in Spanish. Somebody want to take this one? Someone a little more bold, or someone who's not afraid to jump right in there. Fabiola.
Yeah. Agradecida con el Cristo del curso Zoom de las masculinidades diversas que hizo entender a mi novio que tener sexo no es como programar. Ya no dejamos que el MIT se meta en la cama. Siempre me quedaba la mitad de mi orgasmo. Ahora él disfruta de experimentar cosas nuevas. Steffi Jalapa,
Veracruz.
Jalapa, Veracruz.
Great, thanks for reading. In this chapter, I asked participants, what other aspects of your life do you feel are most influenced by your identity or role as a software developer? Can you think of examples that illustrate this? Rolo's response here is, well, my girlfriend once told me she didn't want MIT in bed with us. Rolo was in MIT. The way I began my fieldwork was by doing a summer boot camp in coding at UNAM. He was a student in this boot camp, and when he told me this, I visualized it quite literally, like his laptop was in the bed and it was interfering with his sex life. But then I understood it was more complicated. Rolo had mentioned to Steffi our lessons on the core principles of writing good algorithms, their simple elegance, defined by their speed and efficient execution. So Steffi was associating his approach to their sex life, to which she felt Rolo was bringing this unwelcome MIT approach. For you observant folks here, it's less clear here. That's the textbook to one of the core coding classes at MIT. His partner was perhaps yearning for a sexual experience that wasn't defined by the tempo dictated by the world of efficient coding, with MIT representing the apex of these practices. That she didn't want MIT in bed with them seemed to be a warning to Rolo to leave the hacking in the code worlds, or at least at the door before he entered the bedroom. Remember, I'm interested in following the code work here, how participants see themselves, the code traveling across domains, how the code worlds are influenced by the world outside of them, and vice versa, sometimes in unexpected ways and spaces. So some teasers to my other chapters here. In this chapter where Chavita, one of the programmers at these hackathons who shows up at all of them, is talking about hard work, and his dad was a mechanic, not necessarily thinking about his coding as work, not necessarily being valued. So he told me an anecdote about him sort of reframing his workspace to look more like a mechanic space so that his dad would value the code work. So here I'm thinking about how issues of masculinity and hard work come together at these mostly male spaces where participants enact hacker imaginaries and ethics while they attempt to become chingones, as the title of my chapter goes there. This other one I call Abuelitas as Infrastructure is about the all-women's hackathon in Mexico City, which is framed about hacks for the home, which could be read in a sense of reproducing these normative roles of femininity within the home. But there's other kind of work going on at the hackathon, critiques themselves, women coming together, and this event that really caught the attention to people where at the end in one of the pitches, abuelitas and mothers showed up to sort of, apoyar, support the young women doing the work, which is something I had never seen in the Silicon Valley world of hackathons. Another one here where I'm thinking about iterations, thinking about the software practice in these spaces where you're supposed to prototype objects, develop iterations. What happens when people themselves are being created, when they're framed as Latinos becoming something else? So we see a critique here with Guadalupero, how, what's his name, Mikla Tecutli here, thinking about what he's becoming or not becoming, sort of the image of this Cholo character, but just now with a mobile phone, right? So dimensions of respectability here. What is it that one becomes through these iterations? And thinking here, especially in this chapter with our own Jonathan Rosa, who is thinking about a theory of Latinidad as occupying a peculiar social tense of the always already but never quite yet. So I play with that concept in that chapter. And then this final chapter that brings a lot of this together focuses on the pivot, this startup term that entrepreneurs are taught, sort of two ways to develop a company. You're either, in the Silicon Valley rhetoric, you're either a genius that comes up with some brilliant idea that people themselves hadn't even thought about, that they needed, or you pivot your company, to follow the market until it's successful. So how do folks, especially these young entrepreneurs, I follow one startup that started in Mexico that was aimed at countering electoral fraud. They win a hackathon and come to Sunnyvale here, but then have to pivot their company with the same platform for an ordering pizza app or something, right? So from politics to the pizza ordering, they work on I follow the story of this startup, they work on it, construct it into something else, think about those underlying layers that might allow people to communicate with each other, and somehow it does come back to politics in interesting ways, in an app that's used across protests around the world for this type of communication across mesh networks. You have to read the chapter to tell the whole story. But what I'm thinking about here is how participants think with the pivot, how they pivot their identities, their language practices, their presentation of self across these spaces to make their projects become a reality. So this eclectic cast of code workers thinks with these coding logics and relies on technical idioms to make sense of all sorts of non-technical aspects of their lives, their predicaments as migrants, as transnational or even racialized subjects, their career choices, their love lives, and more. Beyond the analogy making across domains, my interlocutors continue to think with the code and the computing stack as they construct particular subjectivities and imaginaries related to the political and social economy of the code worlds. How do they do this? They recognize the complex intersections between their hacker ethic and the transnational migrant ethic coded as hard work. They mobilize underlying coding principles of iteration and efficiency to attempt to make these work in other domains of their lives, including, for example, in their dating and love and sex lives. They rethink participation infrastructures, build solidarity by inviting programming newcomers, and get caught up in nationalist pushes for productivity as they align with cultures of expertise when they negotiate their normative roles of gender and femininity. They transform the practices of prototyping and iterative code design to interrogate and propose versions of a transnational Latinidad. And they repurpose the tech startup logic of the pivot to represent themselves and projects across the unevenness of Silicon Valley politics. Across these diverse spaces and experiences, Mexican and Latinx software developers use this code work to develop heuristics for analyzing the organization of entities and relationships among them, whether they're elements in a coding environment, actors in a political economic environment, or acquaintances in their intimate social environments. So that's my code worlds and my code work. Now I just need to bring home Techno-Borderlands. So one more. This code work unfolds across a US-Mexico network, the Techno-Borderlands. In this zone, hackers employ the language of coding to navigate boundaries of nation, race, ethnicity, class, gender, boundaries often hierarchical that coding promises to reconfigure, but that also remain essential to a transnational economy of tech and thus also resurgent at every step. In her genre-breaking writing, Ansaldúa develops the concept of borderlands. For Ansaldúa, the lowercase p represents a geographic region separated by the Texas-Mexico border, And the big case B, Borderlands, encompasses the psychic, sexual, spiritual borderlands of her own embodied subjectivities resulting from oppressions experienced due to her culture, health, gender, color, sexuality, economic status, especially her complex relationship to language. These big B, little b borderlands then, in both their geographic and metaphoric meanings, represent intensely painful yet also potentially transformational spaces where opposites converge, conflict, and transmute. So my notion of the Techno-Borderlands plays homage to this term, but also plays with it, examining how the political economy of tech and code work relates to US-Mexico politics, and how their corresponding subjectivities of difference are found apart from, yet deeply influenced by these borders. To explore how hacking cultures across different sites to explore how these hacking cultures manifest themselves across different sites of difference means to follow these varied experiences of developers who work in Mexico, those who travel in the US, to the US, and those Latinxes and Mexicans from the US who travel to Mexico, as well as their physical encounters across these borderlands. But more importantly, it also means to trace the subtle difference making that's enacted, mobilized, resisted, and reconfigured across these techno-borderlands. So I want to take two key ideas from these techno-borderlands, from the borderlands, to carry over to my techno-borderland. Multiple allegiances and in-betweenness. Thinking what the borderlands means to move within, between, among these diverse, sometimes conflicting worlds. Ansaldúa herself frequently moved between these diverging worlds, personal, political, professional. But what connected them was not just overlapping identities or intersecting identities, as Ansaldúa's work is usually interpreted as suggesting. Instead, a steadfast resistance to clear-cut labeling, coupled with an interest in developing novel alliances, makes Ansaldúa's work vital for 21st century social actors, artists, thinkers, and scholars. Her works challenge conventional views that lead to stereotyping, overgeneralizations, and arbitrary divisions among different groups. Her writings open up new spaces where innovative, sometimes shocking connections can occur. So community making across borders of difference is not based on sameness, but instead on commonalities. In the case of our code workers, who are already adept at navigating the layers of computing stack abstractions, the stage is set to hone this code work in order to find parallels between the code worlds and other worlds they might not have imagined, be they the world of the humanities or social sciences, the world of activism, or new worlds altogether. So this call of the borderlands is about finding power in this in-betweenness in the borders themselves. Becoming a threshold person, a border worker, means to locate oneself simultaneously inside and outside of group formation and to live in between these overlapping and layered spaces of different cultures and social and geographic locations, of events and realities, be they psychological, sociological, political, spiritual, historical, creative, or imagined. So bringing the power of belonging to multiple worlds, as well as the transformative potential of existing in between, border thinkers have proposed research frameworks where both ethnographer and research participants shuttle between these differing, incomplete, multifaceted viewpoints to offer more complex understandings of ever-changing social realities by navigating spaces characterized by tension, conflict, and ambiguity. Cyborg politics, combined with intersectional analyses, invite us to think alongside the machines and the systems to decipher structures of power and inequality. Likewise, the argument I unfold across the book is that folks of different backgrounds gravitated toward the code. The seduction of the code world is precisely that it allows us to highlight the visible from the invisible, to illuminate the unknown from the unknown, its separation of software and hardware, interface, from infrastructure, allows us to decide what to show and what to hide as we play with the interfaces that lead us from one layer of abstraction to another. The computer and its stack of abstractions provide a condensation of power that is radically alien to most human experience of the world. It's this alienness that allows software, particularly at moments when one is attempting to understand its workings or to program it, that engenders a delicious moment of feedback between styles of perception and ordering, logic and calculation, between the user and computer, that is so seductive and compelling. Ultimately, I'm arguing that the code work gave these hacker entrepreneurs the tools to think with the system, to move to its bottom layers, to examine how the system works, whether that system is the latest software infrastructure, socioeconomic program, or political reform. So how to bring it all together? How to best leverage this seduction and power of computing, and yet mobilize these borderland perspectives to challenge computing infrastructures that guide the imaginaries and political economy of the programming work. So I lied to you. It wasn't just 3 keywords. I'm going to throw a 4th one in here: border code workers. Those who can connect the border work with the code work, provide code workers with the tools to think within and across these layers of the computing stack, as well as within and across the communities that make up the Techno-Borderlands. Returning to the call of the Borderlands, border thinking provides us a framework to make connections among seemingly disparate events, persons, experiences, and realities, as well as to build an Ansaldua's holistic, activist, inflected epistemology designed to affect change on multiple levels. So I've offered these new concepts, these new terms, to think with the hacking as we develop our own hacks, but not forgetting about work that's been done before us, especially from the middle, but also from below. All this inspired by these keywords, these particular lexicons and software studies, but also key concepts from these other disciplines. And if you want to keep thinking with me in this direction, one really fun project I had complementary to the book is a discussion guide I developed with graduate students. So there's questions for each chapter, activities for the classroom for those of you who are teaching, and you can check that out on my site. And I also have to add, just last week an audiobook came out. So for those of you who are over reading books and want to listen to them instead, now there's an audiobook version. And I have a whole chapter in my book that's really a whole chapter of acknowledgments, but in particular thanks to the folks who invited me to this event, and that is all.
Thank you very much, Héctor. I'm just here to field questions. That's my sole purpose for standing up, and to encourage our MA students to maybe be among the first to go up for bats. Special extra awkward silence. There you go.
No, thank you for being here. First of all, this is super interesting. You mentioned Anzaldúa as like your foundation for Borderlands. She also uses the concept of Aslan to create an identity. So do you see any techno-Aslan identity developing or anything different in there?
Yeah, a lot. So one thing is, this was a very heterogeneous group of code workers that I worked with. So some of them are less inclined to go for these kind of territorialization of place and identity. There were some programmers, for example, that had a Techno-Tenochtitlan and do this sort of, aesthetic, taking the android figures and stuff and making them into these indigenous characters, or combining techno aesthetics, allies. What's his name? His name is escaping me right now. This artist, this Mexican artist from the 90s, 2000s, in this book, Race and Technology. It'll come back to me. So there are people doing this, but in different ways. Now the question, like, do I see it kind of going there? And also on Saldua in general, right? Like before I came here, I thought there's gonna be folks at Stanford that are gonna be on Saldua scholars, which there are, right? So we have to think. I think of myself also as a type of taking on the Saldua and these writers, a sort of bridge, right? Thinking of my role as a teacher who teaches a lot of engineers and scientists, who's their first pass at thinking with Saldua, and they end up loving it. But it's something that is introduced to them through my classes, and they start to think about some of these dimensions of difference and intersectionality for the first time while they're taking these classes in developing software systems.
Great presentation, thank you so much. So I'm going to ask a basic sociological question, which goes back at the sociology anthropology kind of dialogue. Let's put it that way. So my question is, like, what's the socioeconomic background of the people you followed? Because it seems to me, and obviously, I may be wrong, but like if I were to hypothesize that you're looking at two pretty different networks, like one which is kind of elite networks, right? I'm thinking especially in Silicon Valley, might be, yeah, sure, but they're like super highly educated, and kind of part of kind of elite global flows, right?
Mm.
But you also have a second kind of set categories of people who go to hackathons, where it's a scheme for upward social mobility. And so I'm like, you kind of lump like these two things together in the presentation, and I'm wondering if they were actually distinct or if they were all kind of meshed together, and what kind of tension would that add? Right?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for that question. I've thought a lot about this lately. So I have my new project now is on digital nomads, and so in this project, I'm very precise about who I'm studying. Remote workers with ties to Silicon Valley companies, salaried employees. Like, this is my population, this is who I'm studying, because there's so much to say. In this project, it's precisely ambiguous because there's so many different people, right? So the hackathon itself brings these people together. My argument is that some of them brush shoulders, whereas they might not have in other spaces. There are in sort of meaningful or more profound interactions than there would be sometimes because of these differences. But the argument is not about that they're socioeconomically similar, more that they're interested in the code for some reason and what it brings to them. What sort of empowerment are they seeing? Is it a social mobility thing? Is it, using it for other purposes? So there's all of these are included in this group, and the argument is more that, or the question is, why is it such a heterogeneous group of people interested in the code? Why do they show up to similar spaces?
Why don't I take 3 questions at a time? Would that be amenable?
Sure.
Yep. So then 1, 2, and 3, please. Jimena.
Well, thank you so much. This was great talk. This question may be a little bit like a segue to Andrea's question, though I didn't know. I was just thinking as I was listening to you of border environments divided into hardware and software. Mm-hmm. And basically what I'm thinking is, have you encountered in this heterogeneous population a kind of friction between those two?
Yeah.
And because even though Maquilapolis is a film that was made about how the Maquila was working with hardware technology way back before the Maquila went to Asia. Mm-hmm. Now it's coming back.
Yeah.
And I wonder how this there's this, if there is at all a dialogue or tension in these populations you work with, or if maybe you have thought of that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Sir?
Oh yeah, just an aspect of the transnational tech economy. I'm wondering, in your work and socializing with people, to what extent there was any conscious discussion or reflection about comparison of the situation of aspiring or active tech workers in Mexico versus, say, India, at the level of just the networks of hackers you've dealt with, or even in terms of policymakers and government or business organizations.
Fantastic.
Thank you for an interesting talk. So I guess building on this notion of identity, I'm curious if you have any insights into the journeys that these co-workers might have taken to like these hackathon spaces. So more so like thinking about, or these traditional, say, computing students who found themselves in hackathon spaces, especially the individuals who might be thinking more of this as like a key for like, a lever for like social change. So were they from other maybe non-traditional computing disciplines and maybe had a greater sense of computing identity or more divergent sense of computing identity because of that?
That's a great question. Goodness.
Let me see. Let me try to go in order. So, your question about the potential frictions between hardware and software. So, first comment there is to colleagues who are doing really interesting work in this direction. Vero Uribe from UCSD Communication is just publishing a thesis on hardware hackers in Mexico and more how they think about sovereignty, but also thinking through the movement of technologies and like the materiality of the technologies. Ivan Char Lopez, who's doing a history of this type of, from UT Austin, who's doing just published a book called The Cybernetic Border, and thinking about the manufacturing technologies, how they relate back to maquila politics. And then to talk about the hierarchies and the frictions between hardware and software. So that's always people have written about sort of the, who does what type of code work. Because here we're talking about code workers, programmers, and there's all these hierarchies in, are you working at the lower levels? Are you working at the top levels? What's real programming, right? So a lot of the boot camps sort of create people who are at this top layer of the stack where they might be updating websites and working with HTML, this kind of thing. And, sort of more the people who see themselves as real programmers are at these lower levels and able to do this shuttling between the hardware and the software. There's also a dimension there of who gets to be the creative programmer, which Liorani, Sarita Amrute, maybe related to this India question, write about how Indian programmers in this case are seen as people who can do the test cases and do the sort of grunt work programming, but can never reach that space of being the managers or the sort of creative people behind the products, and all kinds of techniques they do behind the scenes or resisting this kind of framing. So there are things I could think about along the lines with your question. Back to your question about India and the. Can you repeat real quick? You want me to do like
just any sort of like informal discussion you observed, or took part in, or more formally, certainly in India, policymakers in businesses and government are actively, focused on trying to maximize their economic benefit and development and so on. Is there any sort of such thing in Mexico or discussion of that?
Yeah, I mean the kind of conversations I heard in these. Especially in more the startup weekend type of events or more industry focused spaces where it's really about revenue generation and creating sort of a new nation. There's always comparisons to India. Israel was another common comparison, like sort of the creative work that was going on in Israel, which has sort of all complicated connections there. And with India, it's interesting. There wasn't that many connections to India, and I think it might be related back to these kind of racializations and constructions of what type of workers we are creating. I think I answered something along those lines. Yeah, and to your question about the identities and whether there were people who saw themselves as, if I understood the question, there's differences between people who see themselves trained in computing versus kind of newcomers who were learning these skills.
And maybe even building on your point about hierarchies of like what type of work is real, maybe computing work or code work. Right?
Yeah, so one interesting anecdote is when I first started my dissertation, I wanted to do a sort of Biela Coleman thinking about hackers, open source programmers, but from Mexico. Like, okay, people talk about hackers in the US and Europe. What about from the South, Mexico to start with? So I would show up to these more underground spaces. Like literally I would see a sign somewhere on the street announcing some sort of more underground operation. type of spaces where if you pull out an iPhone, you're going to get kicked out, this kind of thing. People are very, to the left in this sense, open source technologies. We don't want any sort of connections with Silicon Valley at all. These kind of more stereotypical hacker spaces, right? At the same time, there were these hackathons going on where people were using the same word, like think about hacking in different ways. As an ethnographer, I thought I need to be in all of these spaces to see how people are appropriating this word, this practice in different ways. And then something interesting that happened is that I saw other people doing the same thing. Like people were also going to the different spaces, so they weren't guarding their identities and politics as tightly as I would have imagined. And I thought this sort of movement was interesting to think with and emulate as well, my sort of moving around these different spaces. What kind of work is being done there and why is that happening?
I'm going to close the live stream now, but we will continue with questions. I just need to do announcements at this point for the purpose of closing the live stream, and because I know that hardball questions are coming your way. Please join us again on October 25th, 2024 at 1:30 p.m. for our next Friday lecture, Collective Memories, Postcolonial Ideologies and Present-Day Conflicts, the Mapuche in Chile, by our Luxic visiting scholar, Professor Ana Figueiredo, in the back. There are going to be more announcements after this round of questions, but I think we can adjourn the recorded portion, the live stream portion. Now, please don't hold back your punches.
The hardcore questions have